are 4 pillars that we focus on, and what this subject today is so important about. I want to say a huge thank you to the Better Business Act for supporting this event, and to let you know as well that we are webcasting this on YouTube, so we have a live audience at home, and for that reason, when we do questions at the end, a mic will come round as well, which is really important that we use. The key question we're here to ask today is, how can Conservatives get the best out of British business? The growth agenda is clearly absolutely vital for whoever is going to win the next election. But what we're interested in today is about good growth. So what does good growth look like? How does it benefit different people? And what can the Conservative government do to get the best out of British business? So I'm going to introduce our brilliant panellists here today. So we've got Jerome Mayhew, MP for Broadland and Fakenham, who has a very personal family story about good business leadership. We've got Chris Turner, who's the campaign director for the Better Business Act. And we've got John Oxley, who's a writer and commentator, who's written in particular about green capitalism, to think about that agenda in this as well. But I'm just going to kick off by asking each of our panellists to give a very short definition of good growth, just to start by framing the debate we're having today. So good growth, how do you define it, Jerome?
Well, thank you very much. Good growth is long-term. It doesn't eat itself. It creates worthwhile, well-rewarded jobs and careers that develop as a person develops. I think that those would be the key elements of good growth.
Long-term and people-focused. Chris?
I'm going to say exactly the same thing. Long-term was going to be my one single sort of definition. I think, yeah, absolutely. In terms of people, it's clear. Good jobs. Building skills. I think, however, also clearly. Right now, we also need to be thinking long-term in terms of other externalities, climate in particular. Setting the foundations of growth over the longer term is absolutely key.
Thank you, John.
Well, as ever, the last person has had all the obvious answers taken, but I think something that I think is key is a sense of stewardship, and I think growth and enterprise that is rooted in the community that's around it.
Lovely, I love that word, stewardship. So just to build on that, Jerome, tell us about your experiences as a business leader and thinking about good growth, and then I'd also love you to kind of expand what this government is doing to support good growth, and what more it could be doing.
Okay, that's a big topic. So for those that don't know me, I entered politics in 2019. Before that, I ran a company called GoApe, which is a high rates adventure course. Hands up if you've heard of GoApe. Great. Good.
Hands up if you've been to GoApe. Yeah, that's amazing.
Thank you for your custom. So I have to make clear in all these kind of talks that I was not the founder. That was my brother. He would kill me if I laid claim to that. My brother and his wife. So they're the real entrepreneurs. And then I was the managing director and grew that business to 36 locations now, 34 when I was in charge, around the UK. And then in response to the recession in 2010, we expanded into America. We operate now in 16 states. They operate in 16 states in America as well. And the story was one of straightforward entrepreneurship from my brother and sister-in-law and the tight team of us. But we built the business around our people. We always, right from the start, we wanted to create, that's where I lifted this from, is from our own values, worthwhile, well-rewarded jobs and careers. And as we grew, as the company became more complex, and as we got to stages in our lives where I wanted to pursue a career in politics, for example, we needed to step back. The decision then is, what's the next step? And the obvious one is private equity. I've got very strong views about PE, which perhaps we'll come on to in a bit. And we did flirt with that because that's what all your financial advisors tell you to do. And but what we in the end did was an employee ownership trust. So I transferred all my shares are now owned by our staff. And it's not wholly philanthropic. There's an element of philanthropy there, but their money changes hands, and it's a scheme whereby you agree a price for your business with your staff and the HMRC, and then they get the whole company right from the get-go, and then they use what would otherwise have been your dividends over the next 5 to 10 years to pay a capital sum. You think, well, why would you do that? Why not just take the dividends? And the kicker is, thanks to George Osborne, that it's 100% tax efficient. So you get a price for your creation. You give it a long-term future because the people who know best how to run that business are those who now own it. And it's the right end to our story. And that personal experience gives me confidence that actually policy tweaks can make a very significant difference, because that came in, I don't know exactly, I think it was in about 2015, maybe it was a bit earlier. And they've taken a while to get going, but every week, if you look in the FT, you'll see an employee ownership trust coming up in the headlines now. And I think it's an idea with some higher profile names like GoA doing it. I think it's expanding.
What impact did it have on the business?
Well, look, it's early days, isn't it? Because we transferred the shares, I think it was about October 2021. So the intention is that we turn 1,000 people into capitalists. And this is a capitalist. I'm a free marketeer, and I have conversations with Labour colleagues who go, oh, you're more. In fact, one, I'm not going to name it. So, oh, well, that's terrible. You're more socialist than I am. And I said, no, you've got it totally wrong. I'm a free marketeer. I have turned 1,000 people into capitalists because they have got a stake in a capital business, and that's a great thing. So that's the intention. So far, it's going very well, but these things will be measured in decades, I suspect. And if I have a concern about it, it's whether that entrepreneurial, we're going this way, and that's the thing that gets a business to take the next big step, whether that gets lost in a more corporate approach. But I don't know. I mean, John Lewis has managed for whatever it is, 80 years, 100 years. So I'm hopeful. I think it's going very well, but we'll wait and see.
So policy can make a big difference.
Yes, that policy absolutely has made an enormous difference, and I think the impact is slow to build, but I think it's going to be quite profound because it gives an alternative to PE. One of the problems we've got is that public funds, by which I don't mean government funds, I mean listing. Listing is not even considered by growth businesses. It's very because the corporate controls are really, really onerous. So the reporting, the regulatory controls of listing, even on AIM, are not attractive at all to the vast majority of businesses. And then you've got the PE market, which at least over the last decade, where you've had very low interest rates, have been desperate to invest. I personally think that there's a difference between venture capital, which is useful. Private equity, in the very considerable majority of cases, I think is actively damaging to growth for growth businesses. I recognise that's a personal view, but I'll happily expand on it if anyone asks.
I'm going to come back to you to ask the questions around kind of the Conservative government's record on supporting good growth and what more could be done. But Chris, tell us about the Better Business Act and the campaign you're leading there.
Sure, and thank you for having us. So I'm running a campaign which is now supported by over 2,000 businesses across the UK, and our starting point here is that the challenges that we as a country have with growth are paired by some very sort of pressing issues surrounding the role of business in our society, and indeed also how business is now being perceived by the majority of people. So you're looking immediately those pressing issues, things like huge profits by fossil fuel companies during the crisis at the moment. You're looking at the huge dividends being paid out by water companies as they're pumping sewage out. You're looking at scandals at the top of some of our biggest businesses, like the P&O scandal and things like this. You've got this growing perception that sort of business in the sort of conceptual sense, its role, its duties, its responsibilities as part of our society is somewhat in crisis, and the trust that people have in business is being eroded. So that's a sort of pressing and sort of emotive issue surrounding business and its role. And that is being coupled by these kind of, I guess, a sort of a maturity, I think, in how we are beginning to understand what good growth needs to look like. And that is, yes, absolutely, it's rooted in the long term. It's rooted in the way in which business, as it grows and innovates, crucially, in the long term. It's doing so in a way that it can contribute to some of the really big and profound challenges that we have as a country and as a society. And that certainly could be issues around inequality, it could be issues around skills, but it's also crucially the challenge to get to net zero, for example, as well. So how can business consistently be investing? How can it be a partner to government in some of these kind of big long-term challenges? So that's the issue that that's the sort of swirl of issues that we're kind of thinking about, and indeed that business leaders are increasingly thinking about, because one of the key things that we're tapping into here is a sort of evolving kind of concept of what good leadership looks like in business. Jerome's just, shown a great example of that, thinking long term and the concept of stewardship as well in leadership. So what we sort of, in having these conversations and in working with lots of business leaders, we realized that actually the way that directors' duties are now construed in the Companies Act, they're actually preventing a lot of business leaders from behaving in this way. They actually feel constrained from being able to make the kinds of decisions which I've just been talking about, those kind of long-term decisions, the decisions which are aligning the interests of all of the different stakeholders in a business. And that's because right now in Section 172 of the Companies Act, which is directors' duties, it essentially says that you have to act for the long term, yes, but benefit of the members, so essentially the shareholders. And it does say you should have regard for a wider set of stakeholders, but what does that mean? You can regard and disregard. So what we want to do is we want to remove what essentially is an obstacle there to business leaders acting in these wider interests, acting in the longer term interests of a wider set of stakeholders. And we want to change the Companies Act. So it says, as a director of business, you need to, yes, absolutely be driving the growth of the business and benefit the shareholders, but in a way which aligns the interests of wider society and the environment as well. So it's a sort of common sense. Every business leader knows this to be true. Businesses don't exist in a vacuum. They rely on community. They rely on, obviously, the natural world. And we want to essentially have that truth embedded in the Companies Act, so that business leaders are kind of free to act in these wider interests and in the longer term. So as a campaign, we've got, as I say, 2,000 businesses behind this, and what those businesses are asking for is essentially 4 principles to be reflected in law. But the first of those is the alignment of interests. So aligning shareholders, wider society, and the environment as the interests which directors are responsible for in their decision making. Number 2 is we want to do this by empowering directors. So again, we work with thousands of, and we've spoken to thousands of directors of businesses, and what we hear from them is this is empowering. Doing this in 172 is empowering. And number 3 is that we want this to apply to every business in the UK. So this becomes a default in the Companies Act, because again, you're talking about profound challenges that we need to address as a society, and so ensuring that this isn't something that businesses can sort of have to choose to opt into, but instead is kind of empowered from the get-go. And then the 4th of our principles is that for the biggest businesses, we want this to be reflected in reporting. We're very confident, because of our members and our engagement, we're very confident that the vast majority of small businesses, entrepreneurs, this is what good business looks like. If you're running a small business wherever you are around the UK, you run your business on these principles because you're very connected. You're connected with your community. You're rooted in place, and so this is absolutely what good business looks like. But for the very biggest businesses, that connection is broken because of the scale of the business, as well as some mechanisms like public companies, for example. And so we're trying to sort of rebuild that connection between business and society and our communities. So we want for the biggest businesses that to be reflected in reporting. A lot of that reporting already happening. So actually this reporting piece in many ways is going to be a kind of alignment exercise with what's already in place, climate reporting, for example, and things which are coming down the track. So as I said, 2,000 businesses or so on board, very diverse, those businesses. So all around the country, lots of small businesses, but some bigger high street businesses. We've done some polling, and 77% of the public are behind this. They want business to have this kind of responsibility baked into law. And we've also got big venerable institutions like the Institute of Directors on board with this change as well. So it's also cross-party, crucially. I'm talking about you with your colleagues in the Labour Party, but we've had a conference each year. We've had more of your colleagues supporting the Act. So we're confident that this isn't party by party. We've got cross-party support and we've got public support. So it's a sort of, as I say, it feels very common sense, and our sort of partners in business certainly agree with that as well. So that's what we're all about.
Fantastic, and it's interesting. There's so much public support for that. 77% is pretty substantial.
It is substantial, and again, that cuts across party lines as well. So just trying to remember my numbers off the top of my head. I think it's about 73% of Labour voters, and it's about 66% of Conservative voters are behind the change. So I think when we started out with this campaign, I remember telling my board and advisors, I sort of said, right, our mission with this campaign, other than getting the company law changed, is to make corporate governance sexy. To be clear, we haven't, but getting traction on what are sort of might be perceived as quite arcane, company law. Most people have never heard of the Companies Act. So I think you're right. I think it was striking for us to get that result, because actually over time we found some language which actually makes this quite immediate to voters. The sort of, do you think business should have a responsibility, or directors should have a responsibility to society and the environment alongside their shareholders? Well, yes, common sense. So it's great. It's a great result for us, but it's also growing over time. So 77% now. I think 2 years ago it was about 72%. So it's also creeping up as well.
Thank you so much for that. John, so you've written about that the Tories must become the party of green capitalism. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, I think it sort of harks back to some of my comments earlier, that the market is going to be a huge force for change, and I think the best force for change when we look at a lot of these impending risks, particularly around climate change. We talk a lot about what government can do, and there is absolutely a huge amount that the government can do to facilitate this. But the biggest things that are going to sort of make the biggest difference to moving to a more ecological future, in my view, are the things like the person who gets small-scale batteries right is going to be richer than God. There are people working on technology where you will charge your phone once a year, you will charge your electric car once every 3 months. If anyone gets that to work, they're going to make a hell of a lot of money, and people who invest in them are going to make a hell of a lot of money. The same is true about all sorts of green technology. And really, when we look at the future and we look at living sustainably, there are kind of only 2 ways you get to pre-industrial levels of emissions. One of which is having a pre-industrial revolution lifestyle, and I don't think anyone sensible wants that. The other is being able to do that without pollution. And my view, as someone who believes in capitalism, is that only really gets solved by people innovating, by people getting investment to develop that innovation and ultimately delivering it. And that is going to be far more successful than, say, rationing flights. And I think there is a huge opportunity for the Conservative Party in particular, as the party of capitalism and the free market, to say, look, there are market solutions out there. Yes, there are things that government can do to sort of play around the edges. And I think also politically, there's a huge appetite for that. You look at some of the polling you were citing, but more generally, people are moving towards being very eco-conscious in the way they shop, for example. Particularly something I notice when I talk to friends or people a bit younger than me, when people are looking to hire new graduates. Corporate governance isn't sexy, but green technology is sexy, and the engineers come out of top universities who 15 years ago wanted to go and work for oil companies because you make shitloads of money, are now thinking, I want to work for wind farms because actually there is money to be made there, but also it's really interesting to be working for them and it feels good to work for them. So I think there is a huge market push for that. It is going to be where a lot of the answers come from, and the Conservative Party ideologically should be very well placed to take advantage of that shift if they say, we are the party that backs green businesses, we're the party that really backs British green businesses, and we want to encourage that to flourish.
Thank you. So Jerome, come back to that question. Reflect on the Conservative government's record.
Okay, so I think it's good and it can be better, and there's a whole load of good stuff which we can do. Unfortunately, we've got to pay our taxes. Our tax burden is very high. We all know about it, but where corporation tax, the headline rate has gone up to 25%, the tapering of that, so no increase above 19% from 250 up to £250,000 absolutely helps SMEs, which is about 80% of the businesses that we have in this country. That helps, that protects the entrepreneurial base from some of the increased taxes. The move to, I know we serially do this, but we're having another crack at it, is to open up government contracts to SMEs for contracting. I've been on, pre-politics, I've contracted with governmental organisations, and it's fair to say there are a range of different approaches that they use, and it would be great to make that easier for SMEs. That's very, very useful. There's the Business Growth Fund. I don't know if you remember that. That was the sort of pain money that the government extracted from the big four banks at the end of the financial crisis in 2008. I can't now remember. I think it was about 4 billion. It was either 4 or 7 billion that they took out of the big four to create a pool of capital for SME growth as an alternative to private equity. I think it's become a bit too much like PE, but it's a great structure that could be expanded and tweaked in order to provide an alternative source of more patient, longer term growth capital. They talk, and it is longer term than PE, which is typically a 3 to 5 year window investment cycle. The Business Growth Fund will be 5 to 7 years. They'll talk about, and it's been profitable. So the banks thought this was, we're being penalised for this money in return for government support. Actually, the Business Growth Fund is a revenue generating, profitable business. So why don't we do more of it? I support mildly the Better Business Act group. The reason why I say mildly is because businesses like ours, you're quite right, we'd heard of the Companies Act, but entrepreneurs haven't read it. They certainly don't know what Section 172 is, and it can say what it's like, so it probably wouldn't make a difference to their activities. Where it might do is in corporate, big corporates where you've got external investors. My concern about it is that if you have a legal requirement to have an equal approach to shareholders, the environment, and communities, that sounds to me like an invitation for litigation from activists who say, well, you've got this legal requirement, we do not think that you have complied with it, therefore we're going to litigate. So that's my question mark on that. And then finally, the government has announced, when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, the mini MBA scheme. I don't know whether that's come across your radar, but this is an exceptionally good policy that is rolling out, and it's the government takes the majority of funding of the 3-month course. It's an £11,000 course, which the government, I think they pay 7,250 quid's worth of it. And it sends the leadership team of SMEs to places like Cranfield University, and they give a mini MBA. And I've done that myself. In fact, I'm an alumnus of Cranfield, and I did a 3-month course when I was running Go 8, and it is transformational. It really makes a huge difference because it demystifies the kind of the terminology of successful business and the terminology that your financial advisors are using. Because you're an entrepreneur, you've made it up yourself, and you have that imposter syndrome. All entrepreneurs will have that. They'll feel like they don't really know what they're doing because they've just done it. And those mini MBAs set a structure through which you can accelerate growth, and they're very, very useful.
Focusing in specifically on good growth, is the government's record good enough? And the Better Business Act is a governance approach to encourage that. If that is not all of the answer in your mind, and Chris, I'll come back to you on that in a moment. What more can we do if you're thinking more?
So with my change of hat, and I'm a politician, we all obsess about policy. Politics is all about policy, and actually what we're trying to change is behaviour. That's not often driven by policy. It's businesses reflect, a bit like judges actually, they all try to reflect the society in which they operate. So if you have I don't give a shit, society where we're all just going out for ourselves, and you're going to get corporations acting like that as well. But if you have a society where we value our green spaces, where we say, right, we're going to legislate saying we're going to halt biodiversity loss by 2030, which we have, and that starts to get reflected in the corporations that we have, and you see it in the huge growth of ESG in larger corporations. And if you say, yeah, okay, we need to build lots more houses for young people to be able to buy, but we're going to require you to have biodiversity net gain by 10% through planning applications, which we have, comes into force in January 2024, then that starts being reflected in the society in which we live, and the corporations will follow that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the thing I would challenge in what you said is that I think policy can be a behavioural change tool as well. It can nudge behaviour.
That's true. That is true. And the employee ownership trust is a very good example of that.
Yeah.
In that it gave a path to transfers of ownership that was not previously available. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to pick up those points?
Yes. Well, first of all, Joe, I'm pleased to be able to put your mind at ease on the sort of, as you were saying, whether or not something like Better Business Act would open the door to litigation. Because that's something, I mean, we've got a panel of lawyers, corporate lawyers, academics that we work with on the sort of drafting of a few different versions, the drafting of our amendment. And the way that we're approaching that is essentially not creating no new liabilities at all for directors. So essentially what we're doing is we're building on the existing principles in the Companies Act in directors' duties, essentially relying on directors' good judgment. And so no new liabilities created. So there's actually no opportunities there for litigation other than what's already in place, which is a relief, obviously, and certainly not the intent to sort of create the sort of web of liabilities. I think I wanted to pick up, sort of listening in, I wanted to also pick up on some of these sort of concepts of whether or not we don't think that the Better Business Act is all of the answer either. I think that a lot of what we're saying with the Better Business Act is, yes, there's going to be clearly there's compliance required from bigger businesses here in terms of reporting, but there's no enforcement, for smaller businesses. We're not suggesting an enforcement mechanism here. What we're doing is trying to shift the conversation in the boardroom. In many ways, it's a sort of cultural signifier to sort of say, actually, we haven't really, since the Victorian era, had a kind of a shared definition of what the role of business is in society. There is no artifact there that we all can look at that defines that. And what we're saying is we should have that. We should have a shared understanding of the role that business is playing in society. We should have a shared understanding of the role it plays in all of our lives. That definition should reflect, as you were saying, Jerome, the way that business is a mirror on society to some extent. And so we need to sort of mature in terms of how we all identify business, and then culturally therefore, the standards that we hold it to. In sort of public life and in contributing towards these challenges. So I think there's a sort of, I realise that sounds maybe a little bit kind of woolly, but actually one of the ways in which policy can affect behaviour is in that cultural way as well. There's a sort of, we have an ongoing debate about, do you change policy first or culture first? Can a policy succeed unless you've shifted culture? And clearly there's no kind of clear answer to that. Sometimes policy leads and makes, establishes a kind of, a cultural sort of signpost, which then, people follow. Sometimes policy is catching up with culture. And I think in this case, it's corporate governance. I think you can't expect, a kind of clear cultural signal of the way that corporate governance needs to look. Therefore, I think the law, it does in some ways need to catch up with where kind of business culture has got, because business culture has gone beyond the sort of pure kind of form in the Companies Act of shareholders above everything. But I think in black and white terms of getting this definition down, policy needs to take a lead on this one.
Thank you. Jerome, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. There's one other thing I wanted to add about what the government can do to help long-term green growth, and that is to unleash the power of the free market to start tackling some of our environmental issues, and that's a price for carbon. If we had a price for carbon that affected the entire economy, then the market would be able to decide. You wouldn't have to have government intervention saying you've got to go this way or that way, because the market will, all the myriad decisions that we take as consumers would lead the market. And the prerequisite for a price for carbon is a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So, which I know is a bit of a mouthful for breakfast time, but
do you want to unpack it another level for the?
If you, gosh, suckers for punishment. Okay, so a price for carbon. We've got two glasses. This one's a high carbon manufacturing process. This one's a low carbon manufacturing process. As a consumer, I can't tell which is which because they cost the same. In fact, this one probably costs less because you're not paying for the externalities. We're paying for the silicon, we're paying for the transport costs, we're paying for the profit, the overheads, but we're not paying for the carbon emissions because they're disappearing into the community. And we know it has a cost, so let's call it £75 a tonne. If we put that back into the cost of production, then as a consumer, this one becomes cheaper and it gives an incentive. First of all, this company does very well, so we do more of it. This company thinks they're eating my breakfast, I've got to change my manufacturing process. Okay, that's the basic principle of a price for carbon. It changes behaviour. Why don't we do it? Well, we sort of do. We have a UK emissions trading scheme. It's about, I think this week, about £33 a tonne for carbon. But we can't raise it more than that because it only applies to our domestic economy. And if you raise it higher, what you do is you incentivize consumers to suck in high carbon, in fact, higher carbon because they're coming from China, manufactured goods elsewhere, or your manufacturing processes go abroad. So what you do, you put a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which applies the same carbon cost to imports that you're applying to your own domestic manufacturing base. And that allows you to have a genuinely level playing field. So over time, you can raise the price of carbon on all goods in your economy. It helps you, as I said, in the domestic market. It also helps internationally because it gives a price incentive for sake of argument, Chinese manufacturers to say, I don't want to pay that carbon price. Why don't I change my mechanism of production as well? So that would be a big, bold policy change that would have a profound impact. And the best thing about it is it's conservative. It is truly conservative because it's about unleashing the power of the free market.
I'm really glad I asked that. That was beautifully explained. Thank you very much. And John, I was also linked to my next question, which was around kind of the consumer in all of this. Are consumers demanding better growth behind the products they're buying as well?
I think they absolutely are, and a lot of the businesses I talk to and work with, and I think it was interesting you were talking about glasses. A few years ago, I was doing some work in the recycling industry, and there's a big issue of, at the moment, a lot of plastic gets recycled, but there's not enough buyers for recycled plastic. because virgin plastic, which is brand new, is about a third of the cost, and on most metrics is much better. And the company I was working with were having this huge issue with fast-moving consumer goods, so people like Unilever, who for ages were saying, yeah, we make all our bottles recyclable, that's great. They go into this sort of black box world of what happens there. But we can't buy recycled plastic because the consumers won't accept it, because basically for stuff like laundry detergent, the bottles it comes in, if they are recycled plastic, they are slightly coarser. If you look at the materials side by side, you can tell it's just a bit more rough around the edges, and you can't make it fantastic colours. And then eventually, after much cajoling on one of their brands, they were like, fine, we'll start doing a recycled plastic bottle. And you will go and see it on the shelves now. And if you look at them all, you can tell which ones are plastic because they are slightly inferior. But what they did was they combined that with a load of marketing. Look at our new 99% recycled, fully circular product. And customers didn't mind that their laundry detergent bottle looked a bit uglier, because who actually cares what their laundry detergent bottle looks like? And apologies if you're one of those people that spends countless hours designing bottles for fast-moving consumer goods products. But what they really liked was being able to say, no, this is the real thing. And there was an education piece there to show the difference between recyclable and fully recycled. And it led to a huge buy-in and a big gain for the company. And I think that's there. And as well, at the other end of the spectrum, something, again, I hear a lot when I work with companies like that, is on an investment side, sort of talking to some of the big banks who have these ESG funds. One of the interesting things they were saying, particularly a couple of years ago, before interest rates moved a bit, they were saying, we've got all this money that we are struggling to invest in places because all our institutional customers are piling money into these ESG funds, because at the end of the day, the pension investors, people who are putting money away for their retirement, they want all their money to go into ESG. And so consumers are driving this, and it's just about finding the right way to channel it, the right way to encourage it, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, coming back to Better Business Act, what do you see the blockers to achieving that as being? I've heard a really compelling case for it as part of the kind of ecosystem of change that goes from kind of cultural change to consumer behaviour, but governance being a really, really important part of that. What are you seeing as the blockers to achieving that, and what's your approach?
It's a good question, because we launched this campaign in 2021, spring of 2021. So lose track of years, sort of post-pandemic time, but obviously a couple of years now, and as you can imagine, hundreds and hundreds of conversations with people, policymakers, parliamentarians about it, and as I say, I think it is common sense. So I think actually the blockers in terms of, does anyone agree with the fundamental principle here? I can count on one hand the number of conversations I've had with people who disagree with the principle of what we're trying to do. I think that the challenging conversations come where you're talking about the mechanism, for doing it. Okay, yes, obviously business should have a responsibility for society, for the environment. That's always been the case. And indeed, actually, go back to the great, Victorian businesses, it's baked into great stories of Cadbury's and Bourneville, it's always been there. And rebuilding that connection is one that appeals to everybody. So how do you do it is where the sort of, where the blockers come. And I think, in more recent times, for example, when Kwasi was Chancellor, certainly interested in having this conversation. There was an audit and corporate governance reform bill in the works. And actually the blocker there was that bill sort of got lost, it's in draft, didn't come back. There's a sort of, where does it fit? Where does it fit in a government's agenda? There's a lot of corporate governance reform that needs to happen anyway. So it's sort of sequencing it with all of that. It's aligning a lot of, and again, what we hear a lot from business leaders is there's a lot of stuff that's coming through right now in terms of wider regulation and reporting requirements, which is all a bit disjointed. So actually, how do you do the kind of alignment that's required there so that it sits elegantly with a kind of updated version of Director's Duty? So it sounds a bit sort of tedious, but actually the big blocker is where and when do you get this done? Because it requires primary legislation. And how does it fit with what is an increasingly muddled picture in the corporate governance space of reform and updating what is getting a little bit creaky and antiquated?
I'm keen to bring in some audience questions, but I was just going to go first to my colleague Andrew O'Brien, who I know many of you know in this room, to talk through the kind of the work we're doing around this at the moment and relate it to some of the things we've heard. Have you got a microphone for me? Yeah. Sorry.
Hello? Is that working?
Perfect.
There
Thank
we
you,
go.
Andrew.
Sorry. Yes, I'm Andrew O'Brien, Director of Policy Impact at Demos. So we have, as a coalition, 4 pillars of work, and one of them we call the inclusive economy. And I think getting back to Jerome's point, it's about essentially how to get everybody participating in that economy, feeling they have a stake in it, feeling they have agency and control over that. And I think for us, there are a few key factors to that. One is some work my colleague Andrew Phillips, who's in the audience, been doing some great work on around employability and job creation, and how do we make sure that everyone can participate in the labour market. And again, I think the evidence shows that companies which are able to invest in their staff and training and support and reaching out to communities and kind of creating apprenticeships and training schemes and opportunities in their areas obviously have far greater economic impact and need better results in their communities. There's another area around the green economy as well. We did a recent report this year, Net Zero to Level Up. We're looking at Black Country and how you can essentially invest in the green transition. There are going to be risks with that. I mean, I think as that report lays out, some jobs will be lost, but there is an opportunity to get it right with the right investment, the right support for business, with the right support and help from governments and other parts of the economy to make a net increase in jobs and to bring more prosperity to some of these places, to revitalise and to rebuild them. But again, that requires that long-term partnership between business and government. And as Jerome and Chris and John talked about, sort of realising the gains what markets can do when they work effectively, which is to coordinate and help them make decisions and to leveraging capital. But also at the same time, they require those kind of safeguards, guardrails, whatever you want to call it, kind of institutional mechanisms that deliver kind of prosperity results. And I guess the other 2 areas which are really important for this, one is, a piece of work we're looking at the moment around trying to quantify what the impact of moving towards a more responsible economy could look like. So we know that, there are some in the United States, in the UK, and we look at some of our responsible businesses, that they achieve better financial results, higher levels of profitability, higher levels of growth. They create better jobs. They are more likely to survive economic downturns. And so what would the benefits of the UK economy be if we could shift more of our businesses into that socially and environmentally responsible territory? And again, we think, our hypothesis, and this is what we're trying to test at the moment, is this could be worth billions, tens of billions a year to the UK economy, which at a time when every party is focused on growth would be a real boon to the UK. And I think the final area is around this whole concept of kind of partnership and collaboration between business and government. So the Labour Party says it wants to create a long-term kind of partnership with business. The Conservative Party always see itself as a pro-business party and one that wants to collaborate and to build strong connections with the private sector. But we sort of haven't quite yet developed the mechanisms in the UK. We seem to oscillate between, 1 minute we're creating industrial strategy councils and we're kind of convening people together, then we're abolishing them, then we're replacing them with some other mechanism for collaboration. And how do we get to a place where there is a recognition of what the shared goals between government and business are, that there are appropriate incentives and mechanisms to deliver that, but that there is an opportunity for dialogue and collaboration on those key challenges that can last more than just one parliamentary cycle. Because I think the words, I guess everyone's going to take away from this morning is long term. We need institutions which can deliver results over decades, and therefore we need mechanisms that can last and have confidence from a sector and policymakers over a really long period of time. So that's just some of the work we're looking at around Demos, and this kind of conversation obviously plays right at the heart of what we're looking at.
Thank you, Andrew. Other Andrew, please can you take the mic? And I can see gentleman right on the left in the stripy top first. Sorry, he had his hand up way before anyone else. And then to Seb at the front, and then two at the back. And then I'm going to come to the right-hand side of the room. So,
Thank you very much for letting me ask. I've only got two questions. One of the questions you were talking about, the renewable plastics. In Germany, they have a long history of reusing plastics for drinks. And there is, the way the consumer buys into it, there is a token to return that. People understand that they want the inside, not necessarily the shiny bit on the outside. So if we do want to reduce our plastic intake and use more renewable, we will have to give an incentive to the public to actually have it. The other one, when I walked in, and apologies for being late, was about the green economy and the energy efficiency of wind turbines and coming into as a business area. It would be interesting to see if we could link that in with the local farmers, because obviously this is where we kind of get stuck on onshore energy production, because they are left as the last thought in the actual process. You look at the money getting to actually invest into the business, we look at everything, and then it comes down to where do you place it. And actually it would be quite good to actually move a small micro generation to the DEFRA part, so we can actually get the energy miles down and not so far.
thank you. If we go to the front, Seb, I'll take them in twos and then come to the back row afterwards.
Thank you very much, Seb Ellsworth from Access, the Foundation for Social Investment. Going back to the opening question and sort of definition of good business, and I agree with everything everybody said. I wondered if there was another dimension that was worth exploring around inequality, and a lot of people talked about businesses being rooted in their places, but we all know there are parts of the country which are just entrenched in their disadvantage, and the organisations that do exist there to create economic activity, often trading charities and social enterprises, have been, for a long time overlooked in terms of access to markets. We're in our world, we're trying to get finance into them. But a key part of that are the supply chains from corporates and the extent to which those organisations are able to access those kinds of markets. And so I wonder if, regardless of the detail, whether there is a kind of principle around business having an obligation to think about that kind of deep-rooted inequality in our communities and how either legislation or policy could tackle that.
John, I'm going to ask you to take the question about plastics and green efficiency, and then maybe come to Jerome on the inequality question with Chris following on.
I mean, sort of the answer to both of your questions is yes, absolutely. But just to explore that bit, with things like bottle return at the moment, we still have the problem of what do we do with the plastics at the end of it? And having worked in the industry, the answer to a lot of it is ship it to Malaysia and then just leave it there. And for things like incentivizing people to return their bottles, it's a thing that does work in some countries. We kind of do our plastic recycling here, but that becomes a hell of a lot easier when you've incentivized the other side of the market already, so you have buyers for the plastic at the end of it, because then if there's a market for it, then it's very easy to pay people to give you their empty bottles at the end of it if you know you're going to be able to sell them. And we saw that in all sorts of bits of the recycling industry. In terms of renewables and farmers, yes, I totally agree that farmers have land, and if we're using it, we should be paying them a decent rate for it. We want them to make money. We want them to do these things. I think some of the things some Tories have been saying about stopping farmers from, say, putting solar panels on their land if they want to do it is madness, because generally I think as a Tory you should let people do what the hell they want with their land to make money from it within pretty wide reasons. And so, yeah, if we can build policies that do in that market, that's something I'm going to be talking about a lot more, I think. So, yeah. Thank you.
Business.
The degree in Scotland in the last 6 months, much better that we have a nationwide deposit return scheme which does not include So that's a bit of detail on that one. Right, so inequality. I totally agree with the identification of the problem. It's raised up in my mind further than I previously thought, because of schemes like EIS require there to be enough investors with a degree of wealth in a location to then invest in startups and take the tax risk there. Regionally different. I would hesitate to say that is the role of business to regenerate areas unless their market is coming from that area. So if you are a business that benefits from a very significantly deprived area, then I think you have a responsibility to take steps to improve that area. But to have a generalized business obligation to say, I don't know, you're Unilever, therefore we require you to invest in Middlesbrough because we say so. I think that's confusing the role of government and business. There is, even as a free marketeer, I recognise that people like Michael Heseltine in Liverpool made a profound difference to the regeneration of the whole city through government intervention. So I'm not one of these people who says the government is powerless to this or should be powerless and let the market, get on your bike, move from Liverpool to someone with more employment. That is not the answer. We have the power in government to create changes in regional economic conditions, and that's where the responsibility should lie, not, in personal view, with business.
Chris, did you want to add anything on either of those?
I think I would just, what I would say, I think is probably going back to a point that Andrew made, which is that I think that the way in which some of that deep-rooted inequality will be tackled is in partnership. It's business and government working in partnership, and I think that what we're proposing with the Better Business Act, it is in many ways intended to be the sort of bedrock for that partnership. Ultimately, you can only have a good partnership if you know where the other person's coming from. If you have this sort of meeting of minds in terms of your ultimate objectives. And I think if the responsibility of business is a sort of holistic view of the kind of benefits that it can provide, then actually you have a kind of built-in ability for government and business to partner in the longer term to tackle some of these kind of deep-rooted issues. So I think I would say it's a sort of, it's probably a pretty fundamental building block if we're going to see some of these issues tackled in the way that they need to, because as you say, it's so deep-rooted.
We had two questions about James and Ben. Do you want to take the mic next? And do introduce yourself. That's fine.
Yeah, sure. Is that on? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
My name is James Westhead from Big Society Capital. So we're the UK's leading social impact investor. So my question is about investment, and we've heard about the importance of culture, governance, and so forth. But I wondered how central investment is. And Jerome talked about the problems with private equity, but there seems to us there's a massive opportunity with pools of capital in local government pension schemes, for example, that could be unlocked to drive the kind of positive growth. What kind of policies would you like to see that would enable investment to go to the right places and the right organisations and the right companies that drive positive, better growth? That's my question.
Thank you.
I'm Ben Garrett from Registered UK. Our members would say that good growth means being able to invest smartly in innovation or particularly decarbonisation in a way that also protects the bottom line of today. And being able to do that often means understanding where the government's going on its long-term policies, particularly on infrastructure and energy. That's often a really significant challenge. But what's the whole thing that could be done to address that challenge?
Jerome, do you want to come back on the second question?
Okay.
And then perhaps Chris come in on the social investment question.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about net zero 2050. The Prime Minister's announcement last week I think what you need to look at is what is the policy, the long-term objective, legal objective, and what are the mechanisms by which we achieve that objective. So the objective hasn't changed. I mean, we have, and that is a cross-party consensus. In this country, we will seek to achieve net zero by 2050, but more than that, that by 2030 we'll reduce our CO2 emissions on 1990 levels to 68% by 2030. Nothing's changed there. In fact, I would say it's been reinforced because the government has recommitted to those targets. What the announcement last week did is it said, that's how we're going to get there. The way in which we get there, quite rightly, changes as economic circumstances change. So the important thing as an environmentalist is the outcome, whether it's achieved by EVs or by insulation or by ground source heat pumps or by all of them, which is actually the answer, then the variations between the myriad mix of levers that government and industry has is something which rightly changes with the market. And that's on the market side of it, but there's also, if we live in a democracy where we have an economic cycle of 4 to 5 years, it is quite right that policy is not enshrined and then stays the same for 30 years because things change. Someone said a week's a long time in politics. Well, it is. But what's good is that we have consensus as to the long-term goals, and that should be enough of a market signal to allow for longer-term investment.
Thank you.
Can I just add a couple
Yeah,
of things? Delays to infrastructure is one of my big bugbears that I like talking about a lot. One thing I would do tomorrow if I was in the government is I would just cut consultation periods from 12 weeks to 6 weeks. Most people will respond in 6 weeks who are interested in it, and you just take 2 months out of on smaller scale things that have that consultation period. You just sped them up and it's cost you nothing. And then I think there are a lot of broader things that need to be looked at around planning. It affects housing, but it affects infrastructure a lot. It is something like the Norwegians can build a tunnel for something like 10% cost per mile as we can, and their wages are higher for the people digging the tunnel. So it's entirely regulatory costs that we're putting on. And that comes a lot. You'll hear a lot of people at conference talking about that in housing, but the same thing applies. We have a lot of veto players in the market that we try to appease when we could modify the way we interact with them, we could throw money at them. And so, I wrote an article for the House that focused on HS2 a few months ago, but looking generally at infrastructure projects. And like the shocking realization I came to is if you look at how infrastructure has worked in the UK up until this point, if something hasn't been proposed already, a major piece of infrastructure, it will not open this side of 2070. We need to change that.
Thank you, Chris. On the social investment point.
Yeah, James, thank you. It's a really good point. It's sort of, it would be conspicuous, I think, if we were to have this conversation without mentioning investors. Absolutely crucial to this. I mean, anecdotally, a good place to start in answering this is we, among our 2,000 businesses that support the Better Business Act, we don't have a member of the FTSE 100, on board. And we've had very good conversations with CEOs of FTSE 100 companies who are there. Personally, they say to us, we're fully behind these principles, the Better Business Act, but I can't come out publicly and say I'm in support of the Better Business Act because there isn't a Better Business Act. It's sort of this catch 22, and that's because of their investors, obviously, that they're sort of wary and see it as a risk to come out publicly in support of these principles. So you've got this sort of at the moment, as the influence of investors is profound, and at the moment, the way that business leaders see that influence, it is preventing. So it's preventing this progress. It's preventing us getting further here, and so we're essentially behind the scenes. We're working to kind of influence those investors, big institutional investors, as you say, are absolutely crucial. And again, we've got very supportive individuals and good relationships there. But it's sort of there's a bit of a question about safety in numbers there, you know, in terms of breaking from you know, what is the orthodoxy. I think that the other thing I would say is that there's also some people doing great work, you know, more specifically on responsibilities of investors. So we've got a partnership with Share Action. We have a responsible investment bill, which is a nice complement to the Better Business Act in looking at the duties of investors. So again, it's part of this sort of wider picture of complementary pieces that all need to come together in order to kind of unlock, you know, what we're talking about here in terms of this good growth. You've got to have all different bits of the system sort of, you know, unlocking together. So, you know, we talk about the Better Business Act, we talk about our 2,000 businesses, but actually we need to build a kind of wider kind of coalition here of organisations which have all done the work to show this is what the change looks like, and we've done the research on the benefits. So Andrew's talking about some of the research that's already out there, and we'll have plenty more numbers to come. But yeah, my point really is that totally agree with you on the importance, and that the work on the investor side is probably not work that we're going to do necessarily, but we're definitely going to be supporting it and working with partners on it.
There's a colleague at the back of the right. Any other hands going up? I know there's the gentleman on the left, Mr. Stripy Jumper, also wants to come back in.
Hi, I'm Tom Flew from the Charity State Foundation. Just on your point about FTSE 100, just to add to the mix, we did research earlier in the year, and this is the point about the way that corporate governance regulation can really help shape what's going on. Research showed that in the last 10 years, charitable giving by the FTSE 100, that's what we do, we help corporates give their money away if they want to, it's fallen by 26% in the last 10 years, 40% in real terms, and that happens to coincide with the removal of the requirement to report on charitable giving in annual accounts. That's a pretty good example, I think, of where no one would want in that space to be requiring the giving away of profit. It always needs to be a decision made by the company bodies. But actually, shaping the regulatory environment can really focus minds on that conversation. And in the course of doing that research, and here's a percentage I can do in my head, we spoke to 64% of the FTSE 100 directly, and generally what we got from them as well was that many are following standards, but there's not one uniform standard that means that they know what to report. So I suspect there is more going on, but it's just harder to find. And so there are things that government and corporate governance regulation can do to say check that environment. And that's the bad business.
Thank you, and over here.
I'm Philip Spicer. I'm Philip Spicer, central based councillor. So there's a lot of people talk about structural investment. Councils now our budgets are getting squeezed at the moment, and the time it takes to actually move some of these projects like the Oxford to Cambridge Arc, that's going to be a very difficult project to actually get off the ground and actually start moving. The A6, and it'd be interesting to see how the council are thinking with the government and businesses to actually kind of fund these other things, because it's, you know, driving up here yesterday, the toll road works superbly well. Maybe we should be looking more like that money investment business.
Thank you. Jerome, do you want to come back on that point?
Yeah, so I'm an MP in Norfolk. I'm trying to get over the completion of the orbital route around Norwich. We're missing. We've built typical Norfolk. We've built an entire orbital route bar 3.9 miles. So we're trying to get that finished, and the funding for it is a real struggle. It comes into question we've been talking about earlier, which is the incredible delays that we have on infrastructure projects. The government has indicated, I'm not quite sure where we've got to on this, but we've indicated that there's going to be a change for nationally critical infrastructure and the planning around it. I have two hats in this, because as a politician representing this country, I want that. I want us, for example, the national grid. If we're going to double or possibly even triple our use of electricity between now and 2050, we're going to need an awful lot more pylons. And yet, so I want the pylons, but then I'm a constituency MP and I'm part of a campaign to send pylons offshore in East Anglia called Offset, because my constituents don't want their pylons near them, and nor would I. So this is not a straightforward, it really is not a straightforward issue. I think the least worst option is that you link direct compensatory payments to communities adversely affected by, for example, pylons. If you've got nationally critical infrastructure, which thereby has more of a bulldozer process through planning, then the quid pro quo, I think, should be direct compensatory payments. So, for example, if you've got a pylon route going through your community, your electricity is half price for the next 20 years. Or I made that bit up, but you can see how that could work.
I'm going to attempt to wrap up this conversation and summarise what we've heard today and what's been really quite wide-ranging. Very strong consensus that good growth is about long-termism. But there was a theme underneath it all that I was starting to hear in what you were just saying as well, that we're also in flux about where the responsibilities between business, government and citizen consumers as well, where the responsibilities lie to drive good outcomes. And why I'm so interested in things like the Better Business Act, kind of tried to capture and codify some of that. And I think our colleague from the Charity Aid Foundation made a very good point that actually governance does matter. It does drive different behaviours, and codifying that and coming to some kind of settlement about where the responsibilities lie for our future prosperity is really important. And I just got some great lessons in that as well, particularly around carbon capture, which I really appreciated your laying that out in that way. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all our panellists, everyone who's spoken, and our audience today for asking such brilliant questions. And thank you for coming out so early. There are more bats to reward you. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, well, it is. It is. Yeah, that's great. Good luck with it. How do you feel like you're making progress?
Yeah, we do. I mean, it's frustrating.